I'm Sophie Gee, and this is a very special bonus episode of The Secret Life of Books, recorded live from Princeton, where I'm a professor in the English department, and I'm currently teaching a class on contemporary fiction. And today I'm speaking from the Princeton Public Library to the wonderful Jodi Picoult. Although Jodi Picoult needs no introduction, I'm going to introduce her. She is 28 novels in, with 50 million copies in print worldwide. This makes Jodi Picoult a major voice in our times. Jodi has been named as one of the top 10 most influential Princeton alumni, and she is very proudly a graduate from the Princeton English Department, where I teach and where my students learn. Jodi, I learned recently, also writes hit musicals, which I'm jealous of all aspects of your career, but I'm especially jealous of the musicals. I can't sing at all, but I've always sort of wanted to. And she has written a wonderful show, Between the Lines, which is an adaptation of a novel she co-authored with her daughter. And she has also written a musical based on the wonderful global hit, The Book Thief, by Marcus Zusak, who is a fellow Australian. So for several centuries, approximately 38 plays, many of them masterpieces, were regarded unquestioningly as the work of William Shakespeare, who died in Stratford, England in 1616. Shakespeare, aka the Sweet Swan of Avon, aka the Immortal Bard, aka Upstart Crow, was the greatest writer in the English language. And he sat, head, codpiece, and twinkling gold earring, not to mention receding foreline, above all the rest. Then in the 19th century, that changed. People began to ask whether it was really possible for a glovemaker's son with no formal education, and as Jodi is going to tell us, who didn't educate his two female children, even though he wrote incredibly compelling masterpieces about being a woman, a man who barely had a high school diploma and who'd never been on any work trips to Italy, let alone Denmark. How could this man have written these dazzling masterpieces? Or at least how could he have written them alone? George Bernard Shaw, who many of you will have heard of, no slouch himself when it came to writing plays, coined the expression bardolatry to describe this secular canonization of Shakespeare, the sort of unwavering belief that Shakespeare is the greatest writer ever to have lived. And if George Bernard Shaw's term smacks a little of a green-eyed monster, the challenge that he laid down was taken up by others, including a female American scholar named Delia Bacon, who Thoreau and Emerson, two other American writers you may have heard of, thought was a fantastic scholar and the real deal. And Delia Bacon questioned Shakespeare's authorship, and some top candidates who came to the fore during this period were Francis Bacon, the great Renaissance philosopher and humanist, Walter Raleigh, Queen Elizabeth's favourite, Christopher Marlowe, a rival playwright to William Shakespeare, and a man named Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who was a theatre impresario. All of these people were prominent as candidates for Shakespeare's authorship. But now that's changing again. In the 1970s, the critic A.L. Rouse suggested that a writer named Emilia Bassano, or Lania as he called her, because that was her published name, was the dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets 127 to 152, for anyone who knows the sonnets well. And in 2018, a play was commissioned for the Globe Theatre in London, playfully and polemically showing that Emilia was indeed Shakespeare's dark lady and that Shakespeare was a plagiarist. In 2019, the reporter Elizabeth Winkler, also a Princeton English major, wrote an essay and then a whole book arguing that Emilia Bassano was a co-author and sometimes indeed the single author of Shakespeare's plays. And this is where Jodi comes in. So it's a hugely exciting twist on the Shakespeare authorship story. Whether it's true or not that Shakespeare didn't write or didn't entirely write all of his plays, what this story brings us is the coming to life of female writers in the Renaissance period, the idea that writing was collaborative, it was shared, it was often unnamed, it included a lot of hustle and hack writing. And so the fascinating story of Emilia Bassano has now been told, as I say, by one of the most successful, prolific and loved writers today, a woman who has been holding the quill with assurance and purpose ever since she graduated from the Princeton English Department in 1987 and we're thrilled to be welcoming Jodi Picoult to The Secret Life of Books, live from the Princeton Public Library. One of the things that I think is so incredibly interesting about By Any Other Name is that it helps us to understand these plays as commercial hits.
Yes.
That are being produced in a commercial environment, and they're meant to land, they're meant to work. And Shakespeare was a businessman.
Absolutely, who was a businessman.
Yeah.
We know that. We know he was a producer. We know he was an actor. We know he was a businessman. We have actual proof of all of those things. And the hustle for being in the world of theater really hasn't changed that much since the 1500s. It was, you were cobbling things together. Actual theaters were literally moving across the River Thames. And you as an author, a playwright was nothing to be proud of. Nobody wanted to be a playwright, you had no clout whatsoever. And in fact, it wasn't until Ben Jonson gathered all of his stuff together in a folio that anyone thought you would consider plays an oeuvre of any way. And of course, that's why Shakespeare then had his own folio as well.
So people didn't publish plays.
No. And in fact, you didn't even own your plays. There wasn't a copyright. So the people who owned the plays were the theater owners or the producers of the theater groups. And if you, for example, suddenly got an amazing actor in and you wanted them to play like a fool character, and that wasn't written into a play, you would hire anyone who was available as a playwright to take an old play and just add some lines in for a fool.
Yes.
So plays were mutable. They were not sacrosanct. They were not set in stone. And literally, they were meant to change. The truth is that it's weirder to think that Shakespeare never collaborated ever as a playwright than to make the suggestion that he would have.
Yes, absolutely.
It reeks of almost religious idolatry, really.
Which is a fascinating comparison, because he was living in a period of intense religious fervor and conflict and contention. And Shakespeare, or the author known as Shakespeare, constantly weighed in on he was never afraid of a provocative topic. So one question we always begin with on our podcast is, why is the text that we're talking about a classic? Mm-hmm. But I want to challenge that question a little bit today, because we're actually speaking about the idea that part of what makes Shakespeare's masterpieces classics is that there is this unknown authorship presence, an unknown set of publication circumstances and writing circumstances that aren't historically included in the story of Shakespeare's plays.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about the making of these classics?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that we tend to forget in today's day and age is that what we call classics now used to be basically airport fiction commercial literature of the time, right?
Yeah.
Right? So, you got Jane Austen, you've got Dickens, you've got Shakespeare, or any other playwright of the time. They were hacks. They were writing whenever they could to make money.
And they would all go to see one another's plays, and they would say, oh, that's a good idea.
Right.
I'll take that. Thanks very much.
Exactly.
And that was fine. That's what you're meant to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, this sort of patina that has been gifted upon them came with distance and time. But at the time, they were writing what was consumable art for people. And it was meant to be that way. It was meant to be acted. It was meant to be seen. You were meant to get all these in-jokes. You were meant to cry. You were meant to see violence. It was stuff that was salacious, because that is what packed them into the theaters. And it was a business. It was money-making.
100%.
So, I would argue it was not a classic. What made it a classic actually came about many, many hundreds of years later, when in England, women wanted to attend university and no one could figure out what to teach women with their feeble little brains that would be provocative. And so they decided to create a curriculum around Shakespeare. That was the beginning of English literature.
I find this argument fascinating.
Yeah.
And I love the idea that Shakespeare wasn't a classic, and that's kind of what's important about him.
Yeah.
That he was a dude running a theatre, trying to make it work. And he had to pack people in night after night. So just to clarify, actually, while your intention is that Emilia Bassano wrote many of the plays, you are not challenging the idea that Shakespeare was a very ambitious, very successful theatre owner and businessman. And one of the things that Jodi just alluded to is the fact that when Shakespeare became a part owner in what was called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which was the theatre company that he co-ran, they had their theatre on the north side of the river. It was in Shoreditch, and it was called the Theatre, which needed a little bit of rebranding. So they lost the lease to the land, but they owned the building. And they were such hustlers / publicity stuntsmen / cheapskates
Yeah.
that overnight they dismantled the theatre, carried it across the river, and it was in the middle of winter. So I like to think that the river was sort of frozen and it was frosty and, all that good detail, historical detail. And they put it back up near where the Globe is now, not the exact same site. But the thing that I find really interesting is that apparently the Globe, when it was rebuilt, was twice the size of today's Globe. So they had to get like serious numbers of people into that theatre.
Yeah, there were, and it was cheap too.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of my favorite facts that I don't think I actually got to put in the book was that the person who took your penny so that you could be a groundling and stand and watch the show would hold a wooden box, and you would put your penny in, and that got you access to the theater. That's the origin of the word box office.
And you just mentioned groundling. Can you explain what a groundling is?
Yeah, so, there were different tiers, kind of like there are in theater now, and you pay different prices. Ironically, the best seats now are usually right down at the orchestra level. But that was the cheapest seat, and you were packed in, standing. You were able to throw tomatoes, if you didn't like what was going on the stage. And those were the groundlings. The one who paid for the cheapest ticket would be standing in this packed sort of amphitheater. Anyone who could afford to would be sitting in the tiers above it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I want us to think about what makes commercial work successful, because I think that part of what's so clever about By Any Other Name is that you're suggesting that it was Emilia Bassano's experience, her capacities as a writer, and above all, her imaginative and emotional sort of capacities that made it possible for the plays to reach the level of appeal and success that they did. So I was wondering, as a commercial writer yourself, do you recognize the tricks of the trade in the plays?
Yeah, certainly. I think that, first of all, the thing that brought me to the plays, that made me fall in love with the plays when I was at Princeton, was the complexity of female characters, because they didn't actually exist anywhere else at the time, right? But when you have someone like Beatrice and Portia and Rosalind and Kate, who were like the cornerstones for me of amazing female complex characters, I just thought, wow, nobody else is doing that. That's really cool. So, I think that a good commercial work today is one that is a really strong hybrid between character and form. So you've got a driving plot, maybe you've got a twist, but you've also got very characters that you can connect with on a very visceral level. And in the work that I try to do, there's also usually some kind of message or something that I'm trying to teach you or something that I want you to see a little more clearly or from a different perspective than you've looked at it before. And, not all commercial writers do that. That's kind of my trick of the trade.
Okay.
But I would argue that Emilia Bassano, who I do think wrote some of the Shakespearean plays, that's her hallmark. I think she did write about things that were considered contentious at the time. And I think she wanted people to scrutinize what was considered normal behavior and to put that under a microscope and see if it really should be. Taming of the Shrew is an excellent example of that.
Yeah. And there's a wonderful moment in By Any Other Name when, it's a horrifying scene, when the character of Emilia goes to see Taming of the Shrew and her husband assaults her afterwards and beats her up.
Yeah.
And it's this devastating juxtaposition between what Taming of the Shrew is about, which is about the in some ways it's about the humiliation of women, and then what is going on in the real life of the performance, which is her being owned and dominated by this abusive, violent man. And there's this great line where you say, or you have Emilia say, I think, that the play is not about, you're going to put it better than me, but it's not about men. It's not about men needing to subjugate women. It's about men needing to feel secure and feel right.
Yeah. Shrew has always been a really problematic play because there's been a lot of contentiousness about whether an Elizabethan audience would expect to see women being subjugated as fully as Kate is by the end of that play, where she literally is like, oh, husband, no, let me put my hand on the ground because I don't want your foot to touch the ground. And there are some people who say, well, that is exactly what that audience would have expected. Now, if you, however, think this was written by a woman, it is the biggest eye roll in all of history, right? Because there's no woman who isn't going to see that as satirical. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about Emilia's past, but I do think that there are fingerprints in that play that show Emilia was there in lots of ways. So there is actually like an version of Taming of the Shrew, which is called Taming of a Shrew. And in that original version, instead of there are three sisters instead of two. Their names are Kate, who is the oldest. There's a middle sister named Philema, and then there's a younger sister named Emilia. The father is named Alfonso, which happens to be the name of Emilia Bassano's actual husband, who was a terrible human being. And it was set in ancient Greece. And by the time that entity became Taming of the Shrew, they've cut back. So now there's only Kate as the oldest sister. The youngest sister is now called Bianca, not Emilia. And instead of the overbearing father being called Alfonso, he's now called Baptista, which actually was the name of Emilia's own father, who died about 25 years earlier, so a little harder to connect her to. 300 references to music were added. That's also very tied to Emilia's life. And at the very end, when you see Petruchio calls Kate and she basically, crawls over to him because she's fully obedient. At that point, Bianca has her new husband try to do the same thing. Lucentio is like, come, wife. And Bianca's like, no. And that I think is really telling because it is Kate's obedience that sparks that youngest sister's disobedience because she's been so obedient for the whole play. And that younger sister was named Emilia. So again, peel back those layers, peel back the onion, and I think you start to see her name all over the place.
So speaking of peeling back, let's back up and talk some about Emilia and what about some of the circumstances of her life that make her this fascinating candidate. Before we do that, just to mark what you said about Shrew there, isn't it interesting the way that the plays are refining and putting under a microscope these incredibly important but under-examined relationships like siblings, parents and children, personal motivation, the way that you see what is happening in someone else's marriage and you sort of want it for your own. I mean, it's almost like there's some FOMO in there. And so it's this extraordinary practice of seeing a dramatist refining and refining and refining to create enormous psychological pressure.
Right.
Yeah. Will you tell us about Emilia a little bit?
Can I tell you about Shakespeare first?
Sure.
Yeah,
tell us about it. Yeah.
Okay. So let me first tell you why I think Shakespeare didn't write anything that everyone says he did. So like we said, we know he is a businessman, an actor, and a theater owner. We know that he evaded taxes twice. We know that he had multiple restraining orders taken out against him by business colleagues. We know that when there was a famine in Stratford, he bought up all the grain, jacked up the price, and made his neighbors pay it. So this is the kind of guy he was. So let's just start with that. We know that he never left the country, but he managed to write details about places like Italy and Denmark and Egypt that weren't even available in guidebooks at the time. For example, where the closets are in the Queen of Denmark's bedchamber. We know that he never played a musical instrument, but there are more than 3,000 references to music in all of the Shakespearean plays. We know that he was not formally educated. There's even a question about whether he went to grammar school, which is not a problem. But when he died, he didn't own a single book, not one. And there were not libraries like this around so that he could actually do research. So I'm not quite sure how he amassed all that knowledge. When he died, he also did not have any other living playwright comment on the fact that he died and that we'd lost such a literary light, even though his name was by far the best known in the business. And he was not recognized at all or buried at Westminster Abbey, although far less famous people were. We actually do not have any documents, any plays or any poems with his name on it in his handwriting. The only play that we have with Shakespeare's handwriting on it was a play that was written by somebody else. And it's in the margin. It's a note in the margin. So I have my doubts about Shakespeare. But there's a lot about Emilia Bassano's life that I think sets her in the right place at the right time seamlessly in ways that plug all those gaps that we see in Shakespeare's life. Most of what we know about Emilia comes from one primary source. It's a document by a man named Simon Forman, who was an astrologer/doctor, which was a true profession at the time. Yes. And she went to him because she was having miscarriages and wanted to have another baby. And he basically did all of these interviews that are transcribed and are now in the Ashmolean. And what we know about Emilia is that she was born to a family they were incredible recorder players. They lived in Italy in a town called Bassano del Grappa. And King Henry VIII came and heard them and was like, I need to bring them back to England. They're so amazing. So they became the recorder consort to the king. And then when Queen Elizabeth took over, they were the recorder consort to the queen. And they were Jewish, but they couldn't be Jewish in England, so they had to hide their faith.
Because it was illegal to practice Judaism.
Yep. So at age 7, Emilia's dad dies, and she winds up being given as a ward to the Countess of Kent, which was a pretty common practice at the time. But Susan Barty, who was the Countess of Kent, was really extraordinary and gave Emilia a full legal and classical education, which would have been rare even for a boy, even a noble boy. So for some random girl to get that is huge.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that completely changed.
You've described her as the MVP of the story.
Yeah, she's the MVP of Emilia's life story. Yeah. But it also, I think, is, I said to you before, it's a blessing and a curse because, yes, it sparks her mind, but now she can't turn that off either.
Yes.
And she's living in a society where there's no outlet for that.
She has power, but she can't use her power.
Exactly. So at 12, Susan Barty gets remarried. She goes to the Netherlands with her husband, and Emilia's not allowed to go. So she's kind of like flailing around. She has nowhere to go. She winds up with Susan Barty's brother, whose name is Peregrine Barty, and he is the ambassador to Denmark. And the summer that Emilia is living with him, he takes the diplomatic mission to Denmark, where he meets the king and queen. He meets an astronomer named Tycho Brahe, whose ideas are all over the Shakespearean plays.
And who's big at the time.
Very big at the time.
Yeah.
He has dinner with Tycho and his 2 cousins, who just happen to be named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Total coincidence. And then they go home from this trip. And the next year, when Emilia is 13, she is given to the Lord Chamberlain of England, a guy named Baron Hunsdon, Henry Carey, and she becomes his mistress. And he is 56, she is 13. His job is to basically control all theater, all entertainment in England. And every play that is written crosses his desk and has to be censored for treason. He would know every playwright, every theater owner, every producer, all the actors. And for the 10 years Emilia's living with him, she is 100% immersed in that world with him. And then she gets pregnant. You can't be a pregnant mistress. So he boots her out of the house and marries her off to Alfonso Lanier, the terrible human being I told you about before. That's her cousin, who blows through all the money that has been settled on her to keep her comfortable for life. So she's 23, she has a husband she hates, she has a baby, and she now has to keep her family afloat. And Emilia spends the rest of her life reinventing herself to do just that. We don't hear about her for about 20 years, and then suddenly, in 1611, she becomes the first published female poet ever in England. What?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's huge.
It's amazing.
Huge. And nobody knows her name just even for that, which is astounding. And, you know, you don't start writing poetry in Elizabethan England as a woman in your 40s and just get published. She obviously was working and writing before that, and it's my belief she was doing it under someone else's name. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary story, which you just told very well, by the way. It's like you've done it before. I've said to Jodi that because I'm an academic, it's very hard for me to challenge the idea of Shakespeare's authorship. You know, it's so frowned upon in the academic world. And so I can't say, you know, you've totally won me over. But what I find utterly compelling about the story is that we're hearing about a woman's life as a writer that was unheard of in the period. It really had no precedent. I mean, the fact that she published this book of poems, which has quite a forbidding title. It's called, Salve Deus Rex Judeorum. And it's a wacky collection of poems, isn't it? Because some of them are about religious matters, which
Most of them are.
Yes. Yeah. That was what you were supposed to write poems about.
If you were a woman. That was all you were really allowed to talk about.
Yeah. Exactly. But she does it with a spin.
Let's also point out she's Jewish. Yeah.
Although baptized in the English church, which would have been a commonplace in the period because since the medieval time, Jews had been expelled from England and you were not allowed to practice. So she was living a closeted life in many ways.
Yes.
And in the poems, the religious poems, she's sort of retelling the Bible from Eve's point of POV.
Yeah.
And, you know, Eve is in a kind of, well, some scholars have described it as a queer relationship, although, you know, I think that you have to slightly strain to get there. But with Pontius Pilate's wife, with Mrs. Pilate. So, you know, I mean, there's definitely some fanfic opportunities there. And then she also wrote in the same volume, she wrote the first country house poem, which was a thing in the Renaissance world to write about a big house.
Which also has been credited for years, the first country house poem to Ben Jonson, but it was not. It was Emilia.
Yes, that's right. It was credited to him for Penshurst. And so let us just have a moment to recognize that this woman is an incredible literary innovator. And we're going to talk about the textual examples in one moment, but I also just want to reorient people in thinking about the world of literary production in this time. You know, it's not decorous and well-behaved and organized by publishers in the way that literary life is now. There's no copyright. This man, the Lord Chamberlain, had incredible power over what people wrote. He had veto power, essentially.
Yeah, and also more than veto power, you'd get thrown in jail.
It was dangerous to be a provocative writer. So I just want us to pause for a second on these literary circumstances that you're describing, because it's more than just challenging authorship. It's reorganizing our sense of what the Renaissance literary world felt like, especially for a woman.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, there really wasn't much of a Renaissance literary world for women, honestly.
No.
There wasn't supposed to be. And, you know, for Emilia to not just worm her way into it and find a way into it, even if it meant giving up her own credit for the pieces that she wrote, but also to write subversively about so many topics.
Yes.
Even the poems that have her name on them. Like you said, the main thrust of that book of poetry is that all the men in Jesus's life left him.
Right.
The only people who stuck around were the women.
Yes.
That's something you usually want to say to guys, right?
Yeah, totally.
Especially then.
Let alone about Jesus.
There's one poem that's called The Defense of Eve, where she says, you know, if men are so much better than women, then how come when Eve gives Adam the apple, he doesn't just say, you know, I'm really not hungry? And we were talking about this earlier, the fact that she was doing this and was hoping that it was going to make her money is such an irony. Because men were still buying the books for their wives. And she had like a whole list of 11 patronesses who were very wealthy women or male women who she hoped would basically pay for her to keep writing.
Let's talk some about the texture of the plays that you have found, where we see what you've described as Emilia's fingerprints or thumb marks on the texts. And again, just to kind of back up, for people who aren't really willing to make the jump to challenging authorship, we can still think about the living presence of this woman in these plays, however it gets there.
I'll use a couple of examples. The first one is Hamlet, which, you know, we talked a little bit about. Obviously, when you know that Shakespeare never went to Denmark, and yet you know that Emilia likely did and met people named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I mean, that kind of gets you thinking, right? But in addition to that, there are other little bits of Hamlet that are very interesting and very resonant with Emilia's life. So in the play within the play bit of Hamlet called The Mousetrap, Hamlet starts talking about the player queen, and her name is Baptista, which happened to be Emilia's father's name, but was also her middle name in her own baptism. And then he goes on to give this very weird description of how to play the recorder. Weird because Shakespeare did not know how to play the recorder. However, Emilia's family, they were literal experts at it. And if that isn't enough, they even make a pun. He makes a pun in this little section on the word excellent, which means both excellent as you know it and EXILENT, which at the time was the smallest recorder a human could play. Now that's pretty specific knowledge there,
That's
right?
niche right there.
Very niche, in addition to that, there is foredoomed Ophelia.
And who we love.
We love Ophelia. And, you know, one of the things that's interested me the most about Hamlet is that with the rise of female academics, we didn't have female Shakespeare scholars for a very long time, and now we do. And many of them look at the character of Ophelia, and what they see in her is, here is a woman who literally does go mad, as opposed to her boyfriend who's pretending to be mad, Hamlet. And there's plenty of textual evidence that Hamlet is sleeping with her or has tried to sleep with her or whatever. I mean, it's all over the place. And basically they say, well, he probably knocked her up. Got her pregnant. And now there's plenty of examples in the play where Ophelia tries to go to Gertrude, to Polonius, to Laertes, to Hamlet, to everyone, because she needs help. She's pregnant and she's unmarried. And nobody is paying attention to her because they're all dealing with their own little revenge schemes. And so what happens? She starts going mad. There's this amazing scene where she starts giving out wildflowers, right? It ends with, I'm going to give you rue, I'll wear mine with a difference. Every wildflower that she gives out is something that would have caused an abortion naturally at the time. That is something that female scholars picked up on.
I mean, it's so moving to
Right.
think about.
So the other examples that I like to use, Romeo and Juliet's a quick one. In no Shakespearean play is the age of the female protagonist mentioned, except in Romeo and Juliet. It's mentioned 3 times. Juliet is 13. It is always in conjunction with whether she is ready to have a sexual relationship. That is the exact age that Emilia was when she was given to the Lord Chamberlain to be his mistress.
Yes. It's an extraordinary fact. And one of the things I thought was beautifully done in the book is rendering the vulnerability and the unreadiness, the innocence of Emilia.
That
And
age.
actually, Hunston, to do him justice, holds off a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny because Hunston, who she's with for 10 years, we don't have any extant communications. I don't really know what their relationship was like as a fiction writer, but I do know from reading those diaries from Simon Foreman and the Ashmolean, she speaks very proudly of the 10 years she was with him. She knows that he treated her well, that he gave her money, that she was called beautiful, that she was well liked at court. So that period of her life was definitely a calm one and one that she felt good about, as opposed to what she says about her husband.
Yeah.
So I kind of extrapolated from that, and I made him. Look, it's not a great relationship, but I think it's the best it could be at the time.
Yes, right? And it's also just for historical context for a aristocratic or elite man to take a mistress or a courtesan.
Right.
Was not an unusual circumstance at the time. One thing to remember about the Renaissance world is that we're not in Jane Austen land. Like it's not sort of tea parties and, whispering and someone else is always in the room. It's pretty randy and raunchy and, lots of sex.
This is absolutely the spiciest book I've ever written. 100%. Yeah.
It was 100%. It was saucy.
The example I like to give most about Emilia writing is Othello, which is called The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. And that play actually comes from a short story written by a man named Cinthio called Gli Hecatomiti in Italian, original Italian, a language that Shakespeare did not speak. And in that short story, the only named character is Desdemona. And the plot's pretty much the same. It's a black man who basically feels intense jealousy and kills his wife. And so scholars have said for years, well, where did Shakespeare get this name Othello from? Well, what's really interesting when you pick the play apart is this one speech that Iago gives where he talks about a series of metaphors that are really weird. He uses the term prime as goats, hot as monkeys, salt as wolves, and then he talks about the door of truth. Okay, he's talking about jealousy and revenge and trying to get Othello goaded up. But in the town of Bassano del Grappa, Italy, where all of Emilia's family came from, there's a big main square. And there's a very famous fresco there that has in it wolves and goats and monkeys and a woman who represents truth between 2 arched doorways. There are also 2 apothecaries in that square. One is called the Moor. That was the name of the shop. The other was run by a man named Otello. Just like in some of the other works of Shakespeare, there are 2 versions of Othello. The first was published in the first quarto with 3 other plays, and the second later was published a few years later in the first folio with all 38 of the plays. And the difference between the 2 is approximately 161 lines, and Shakespeare died after the first quarto was published, but before the first folio came out. So we know there's 160 lines that were written that Shakespeare didn't write. And how do we know this? He's literally dead. Okay, somebody else wrote them. The lines are given almost exclusively to one character in the play. It's Desdemona's servant. It is widely considered to be the first feminist soliloquy in theater because it talks about how men have revenge and lust and hate in their hearts, and they teach it to women. And for that reason, men should not be surprised when their wives act that way too. And the name of the servant of Desdemona who gets to speak all this stuff is Emilia.
Unbelievably compelling documentary material that you have presented, and I am the first to acknowledge it. And moreover, you have rendered it into a completely convincing story about a woman who is a mother, she is a wife, she is a mistress, and she's a writer, and she's trying to balance all these things. And so I'd like us to get to these extraordinary slides that you have, but just before we get there, will you say something about, beyond the excitement of the authorship controversy, how you knew that Emilia's story was one that you wanted to tell as a writer? You said before that as a commercial writer, the message is important.
Yeah.
And so what's the message?
Well, the message really is that gender discrimination is alive and well in both publishing and theater. That's something I've talked about for years now. And I've faced backlash from male writers. It's something I experienced as a theater writer in today's world. But it is very real. And the fact that it was happening 400 years ago and it's still happening today, and that, extrapolate that out a little further. Women are judged differently than men are, period. You only have to look as far as the White House to see that, right?
Yeah.
And, I feel like that's a really important message. I was talking to you about the fact that Onyx Storm, Rebecca Yaros's latest book, of course, sold 2.7 million copies in its first week.
Good effort.
Right. Fantastic.
Solid.
Right? Yeah. I mean, maybe better next time. But amazing feat.
Yeah, incredible.
And what do you hear in the media? People are reading dragon smut. Now, I just want to point out that George R.R. Martin has more sex in his books, but that's just called fantasy.
Yeah.
Now, why is that? Why do we have women's fiction, but no men's fiction? Why, when I'm on a plane and I say, someone goes, what do you do? I'm a writer. Oh, you write children's books? No. You write romance?
Right.
My point is, we are all Emilia.
Yeah.
And honestly,
this
book was not a why am I writing this book? It's how can I not write this? And I will argue that there's probably more of me in this book than any other book that I've ever written.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Did you write about your own experience as a writer when you were thinking through? Because there's also a shadow story in the present, which is about a playwright who's a woman,
right? And
she is enormously discriminated against, and ultimately she triumphs, but not without. It's a pretty bittersweet triumph in a way. And so, how did it feel to, in a way, be writing back to the literary establishment in that?
In a way, I'm still new enough to the theatrical establishment that I was, shooting my shots out. No one even knew I was there. But when I was writing Between the Lines, the musical, everything that Melina is told in this book, she is a descendant of Emilia's, and she has written a play about Emilia's life. And what she is told when she tries to get it produced is, it's too small, it's too emotional, nobody wants to see a girl's coming of age story. All of those things were things I was told about Between the Lines. And at the same time, 2 boys coming of age stories were playing on Broadway at that moment. And when you think that 80% of ticket buyers for theater at Broadway are women, where's that disconnect? And the answer is in the theater owners. Again, it goes back to the theater owners, who are, to a fault, a bunch of old white men. And what they tend to pick to put into their theaters are stories that reflect their own experience. And the problem is that when you come in from Iowa to New York City to go to Broadway and you only see a certain kind of show, you think, well, maybe that's the only story worth telling. And suddenly you've perpetuated a myth.
Yes.
And so in that sense, it's really dangerous to not poke that bear. And that's why I felt like I really had.
It's enormously important. And to put alongside the question of exposing the reality of Emilia and Melina's experience as women writers with the realities of or not so much Melina, but of Emilia's lack of control over her reproductive choices, it becomes an incredibly
this is a woman,
potent story.
Yeah, her problem was that she had a brain, but her only value to society was as a body, either as a mistress, as a mother, as a punching bag. And I would argue that in the scant months since I published By Any Other Name, America has taken some dire steps back toward that.
Let's move into the final stages of our conversation. And I'd like to ask you about these beautiful pictures that you took of the miniatures around what I think is the most joyful relationship in the book. Emilia's relationship with the Earl of Southampton, which is a love story, and it's very captivating. It has a sad ending, but they're very spellbinding scenes. So will you take us through that story?
So again, going back to primary text, I was writing about Emilia. I fell in love with her. I just adore her, and she had a really, really hard life, and I wanted to give her a little bit of joy. And I was reading this document about something that happened when she was in her 50s. Her terrible husband finally died, and she was supposed to get money that was owed to her from a patent that he had. But instead, her brothers-in-law stole the money, and she took herself to court. She took them to court. She represented herself, just like Portia, Merchant of Venice.
Yes.
And at the end of this trial, out of nowhere, the Earl of Southampton walks in and says,
So he's a very important, influential figure in the Elizabethan world, one of Elizabeth's most influential courtiers, and James, and he reinvented himself as one of James's most important courtiers, despite having been part of a treason plot at the end of Elizabeth's regime. So he's got a lot of male power.
Tons of power, and a big supporter of the arts at that point as well.
Yes.
And so he's an aristocrat, and he walks in out of the blue and says, I'm not the magistrate here, but if I was, I would find in her favor. I walks out. And I'm like, what was that? Because there's just no world in Elizabethan society where an aristocrat would just show up at some governor's trial and try to change the outcome. And then I thought, did they know each other? And I realized, Emilia was at court for 10 years. Court was very tiny, very incestuous. Emilia was about 3.5 years older than the Earl of Southampton. And they absolutely would have known each other. They absolutely would have met during that time. And I thought, here's this poor girl who's having a relationship with a guy who's, 35 years, 40 years older than she is. Why not give her a little bit of joy? Let's let her fool around with Southampton, right? And I think it was like widely considered to be a super hottie at the time. So I'm like, let's have a time. Let's have a good time. Yeah. So I write this really doomed relationship in because they don't wind up together. There's, again, no world in which she's going to marry the Earl of Southampton. But I write this whole relationship in it. And when I finish the book, thinking I've written something totally fictional, I then go to England and I go to the Victoria and Albert Museum because that is where the miniature of Emilia lives in archives. Okay, here's Emilia. Great. And this was painted by a guy named Nicholas Hilliard. And Nicholas Hilliard was a very famous miniaturist. And, there she is. I'm very, very excited because she's not out for public consumption. So I got to hold her, see how excited I am, right? I just spent like a year with this woman, and here she is in my hands, and she would have held that. That's so cool, right? But this is the box where all the Hilliard miniatures are kept. And my eye keeps getting drawn to the guy to her right, which, as you can see, is different from the others. It's not on a blue field. And I asked the archivist, who is this guy? And they tell me they don't know. It's called an unknown man. They tell me it was painted the same year, roughly, as Emilia's, that the decisions he made would absolutely have been the decision of the sitter of the portrait. So that black background and the fact that he has his hand over his heart, all of those probably indicate despair, as does the fact that the portrait is on the back of a playing card that is the 6 of hearts, which in cartomancy, which is kind of like Elizabethan tarot, is the soulmate card. It means this is the person I was meant to be with that I can never be with. And they tell me again, they don't know who it is. And I go, I think I know who it is. And I pulled this up. Oh, there he is. That's him closer. Okay, sorry. You can see his nice little ruffly collar too. I pulled this up on my phone. This is the Earl of Southampton. It's an accredited portrait from 4 years later, 1594. It too is painted by Nicholas Hilliard. And you can still see that lacy collar. You can see his long curly red locks like mine. And it was painted on the 3 of hearts, which means someone has entered our relationship that is going to tear us apart. And in my book, in that year, I have Emilia beaten so badly by her husband, she crawls to Southampton. And, and it's on a red field, which you can interpret as anger probably. So I show this to them and they're like, what? And they said, well, we have to do some research. So I said, I have to do some research. And went home and I found this portrait. This guy on the right is also an accredited portrait of Southampton. It was painted by John de Critz, and it was painted the exact same year as the miniature to the left of it. And you can really see the similarities in the facial structure, in the clothing, in the delicacy of his limbs. And I sent this to the archivist, and they wound up sending me back a 35-page document about how they had come into possession of all of the miniatures, tracing them back and saying, we do believe based on all this, this could very well be the Earl of Southampton. Which means that for about 250 years, which is how long they've had them there, Emilia and Southampton have been cozied up next to each other in the archives. So I'm
That is a great story. It's a great story. So their romance has been happening all along.
I think so. Yeah. But you know what? It's funny because, as a fiction writer, you don't set out to discover things like that. But I think sometimes I was putting together threads that historians and academics weren't bothering to.
Yeah, what I recognize in myself is that the taboos about the kind of speculation that you can have as a historian or a literary historian mean that you can't make connections that a fiction writer can. And this is a nice point for anyone who's thinking about the power of creative work.
Yeah.
It's a counterfactual. It's writing against history because you're working with history in a
Right.
different way and you're transforming it.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's funny because so many people said, well, I need to know what's real in this book. My own husband was like, I need to know what's real in this
Yeah.
book. And the vast majority of the facts about Shakespeare's life, Emilia's life, Southampton's life, they are absolutely real. Like to the
Yes.
point where some poor soul did a compendium of what went on every day of Queen Elizabeth's reign. And it's a giant PDF document. So when I tell you that there was a tourney at a certain council
Yes.
on this day, and these were the people who were jousting, that really happened.
Yes, it's a very well documented period from that point of view. I don't think I told you this ahead of time.
Great.
At the end of the podcast, we always have two questions.
Okay.
They are, what's the best bit and what's the worst bit in the book of the week? So in this case, in the Shakespeare plays that you have thought about. You can have some thinking time while I ask the second question. And the second question is always, is the writer overrated or underrated?
Well,
So
that's
let's
easy.
start
Yeah.
with the best bit and the worst bit in the plays attributed to William Shakespeare.
Okay, so
that you looked at.
This is totally me. This is my bias, and it's very pedantic, but I get asked all the time, what's your favorite Shakespearean play? And I always say Romeo and Juliet, which is definitely not one of the highbrow ones, right?
That's a great choice. So say why.
Because I am so happily married, and I'm still waiting for the guy who just speaks naturally in a sonnet with me. Right?
Yes, because there's that moment when they speak a sonnet to each other.
It's the romantic thing
Yes.
ever for an English
Yes.
major.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, Tim's in the back, start studying. Because it was so cool.
That's right.
To have that reflected in the language is so
Exactly. It's a dialogue moment in Romeo and Juliet, and they're making a sonnet together.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's, interestingly, to bring it back to Emilia too, there's a play of Christopher Marlowe's where he does something that hasn't been done before, where he basically finishes out an iambic pentameter over the course of two characters speaking one line.
Yes.
And when she reads that in my fiction, she's like, what just happened? That was so cool. And then he winds up becoming a mentor to her as a theatrical
That's
writer.
a great moment.
Yeah. And so I think, again, being focused at the line level like that as an English major, that is what really, blew me away about that.
Totally. The metrical possibilities.
Yeah.
that
And I would
English
say
gives
the
us.
worst has got to be, it's probably Coriolanus. Does anyone like that play?
No.
No, 6.
Yeah, good call.
Simple
Didn't get rid of Coriolanus. Overrated or underrated?
Well,
William Shakespeare.
I think that really depends on if you're talking about the person who wrote the plays or the person who is assumed to have written the plays.
Yes.
And I would say that Shakespeare is not a playwright. He is not even a man anymore. He is a mythology. And that to really talk about Shakespeare, you need to strip away all of that artifice that has been lacquered over for 400 years to find out what it would have been possible for him to do and what it wouldn't have been possible for him to do. And, we've talked about this before too. Nobody loves these plays more than I do. I really love them. All I'm asking people to do is, instead of looking at it from this point of view, which we've been doing for 400 years, I'm saying, could you just walk over there and see what you see from that angle?
Yeah.
Because that would be really interesting, wouldn't it? And I think it allows people a way into the plays for many novices who haven't, cottoned to Shakespeare before.
Yes.
They couldn't find their way in. And I love that. I love the idea of somehow bringing more people to the plays by maybe saying one of the writers might have been much more like you than you thought. So in that sense, I would say Shakespeare's overrated, Emilia's underrated.
I love it. Absolutely love it. And I just want to put in a plug for the humanities in general, because, one of the things we spoke about earlier is this idea of perspective shifting, this idea of looking at a question from another angle, allowing there to be multiple angles, simultaneously true, simultaneously in circulation. This is what reading teaches us to do. This is what the humanities train us to do. It's a particular kind of critical thinking, and we must protect it.
Yeah.
And books like yours help, many more people think in these kind of flexible terms. So it's really wonderful. You've been listening to The Secret Life of Books.